Hello, Humanities 1302. I hope everybody is doing well. But anyways, for this video, the topic that we're going to be covering is going to be that of Napoleon's army, that of the Grande Armee. And as we talk about this unit, we're really going to be building on the human experience for the soldiers that had fought in the Grande Armee and building off of what we had talked about last week with the French Revolution and seeing how this particular unit is going to carry on really the legacies of the revolution and spread it to the rest of Europe, even though we do see the downfall, the possibility with a republic when we see Napoleon take over France. But nonetheless, we're going to be focusing on his army that he forms during this period, and once again, how they're going to spread the ideals of the revolution. Now, as we dive into this particular topic, I do want us to understand that as we talk about the soldiering within this army, we're not going to be focusing so much on the battles. We're not going to take a bird's eye view of what's happening with the Grand Armée over this period. We're really just going to be talking about, as I mentioned before, the soldiers' experience. We're going to talk about really what were common experiences that they had, life, say, on campaigning in general, what it would have looked like in general out on the battlefield, really using kind of that John Keegan from our readings, really using his view on the individual soldier's experience. And we'll talk about what the average soldier would have looked like in the Grand Armée, what they would have been doing, and so on and so forth. But anyways, to begin our discussion over this topic, before we can actually dive into the formation of the Grand Armée in 1804, I want to turn the clock back to the Revolution and as well as a little bit before the Revolution, and see how the Revolutionary Army and later the Grand Armée is going to be drastically different than many military bodies that you would see, especially over in Europe at this particular moment in time. So first, I want to go to the topic of the officer corps. And I want to go back to the armies under King Louis, but you also see this under virtually every single European power throughout Europe at this point. Now, at this point in history, we're going to take the armies of King Louis the 16th. In order for you to become an officer, you had to purchase that office. This is something that had long been a tradition throughout centuries of European history. And we'll actually even see the British Army and other European armies would continue to allow this practice up until World War One. Now, why this is important for us is because it makes the officer corps a part of a very exclusive class. Really, the only people that will be able to purchase their post within the officer corps are going to be members of the aristocracy, of the nobility, of the upper class. And as a result of this, you will see while there will be some effective officers there, you're going to see that there's not going to be a whole lot. They're going to have a lot of resentment, especially towards average conscripts within their armies. And many points, you'll see that they won't actually look out to the interests of their soldiers. Now, the revolution is going to drastically change that. Because with the revolution, as we talked about last week, it uproots the revolution, or I shouldn't say the revolutionary ideals. It completely uproots the aristocratic system that was in place, the feudalistic system that was in place in France. We see a breakdown of the social order to where no longer are individuals divided by titles, by birth, and so forth. And similarly, that's going to be adopted within the military. You'll see that the Revolutionary Army, in order for you to gain promotion, in order for you to become an officer, it'd be based off of merit, off of what you've done out on the battlefield, as opposed to purchasing your office or it being based off of birth. And so this creates a much more equal environment, if you will, within the Revolutionary Army. And this practice will carry over under Napoleon. And Napoleon himself, very much so, is a product of that system of promotion via merit and being able to be put into the right position at the right time to eventually seize power. Now, also, what the revolutionary government is going to introduce to the army that we'll see characteristic within the Grande Armée as well is going to be what's called, and I'll probably butcher some of these French terms, but it'd be J'avais en masse, if I believe I'm saying that correctly. And essentially, through this, what they're going to be doing is conscripting large numbers of Frenchmen into the army, virtually everybody between the ages of 20 to 25. And this would not discriminate against people based off of birth, based off of previous status. You'll see that the nobility as well as the peasantry would be drafted into the military on equal terms as well. And this will lead to the Revolutionary Army and later the Grande Armee to be extremely large. And why is that important? Well, it's because they're going to completely shock any of the other European armies that they're going to confront, at least initially during the Revolutionary Wars. When we see war declared in 1792, when you see France and Austria go off to conflict, other European powers, they typically had employed very small professional armies, often hiring mercenaries to do the fighting in the various conflicts up to this point. And you see that practice continued by the other powers. However, they'll be completely shocked by by the French armies because they'll be extremely massive. They'll be made up of really the masses of French society who were really installed with a great sense of patriotism because the French army, I mean, it was used as a vehicle to protect the revolution, to protect the revolutionary government from outside invaders who had restored the old monarchy. And so it becomes a very powerful institution. And it's no surprise that you see Napoleon rise up in that institution. But anyways, now that we kind of have an understanding for what was happening in the Revolutionary Army and how it will impact the Grande Armée, let's turn our attention to the Grande Armée. Let's start talking about really its makeup. What is its background? You know, how does it come into being, and what does it look like for a soldier fighting in this army? Now, the Grande Armée, it will be formally formed in 1804. And Napoleon is going to form it for several reasons. First, the Grande Armée is going to be formed as a massive force to eventually invade Great Britain, or at least a planned invasion of Britain. Now, long story short, this invasion never comes, and it's largely because of the fact that Napoleon's just simply never going to have the naval superiority to overcome the British Navy. And we'll see that this is going to be the case for the British as well as for the French under Napoleon during the course of the Napoleonic Wars. Is that the British Army, or the British Navy, is simply too large for the French to invade, and then the French Army is simply going to be too large for the British to take the French head on the continent. But we will eventually see them clash at the Battle of Waterloo. But anyways, that's for a topic in the future. But anyways, part of the reason that the Grand Armée is going to be formed is for an invasion of Britain. Another reason that it's going to be formed is because we'll see it'll try to quell many of the petty rivalries that we had seen characteristic of the Revolutionary Army. And what do I mean by this? Well, this is going to be something that we will slightly talk about, somewhat similar to what we'll talk about during the American Civil War in our next unit. But anyways, with the French Revolutionary armies, it wasn't one singular army. You had several separate units. You would have, say, the Army of Italy, which Napoleon had commanded at one point. You would have the Army of the Frontier fighting against Austria on the French frontier, as well as several others. And why is that important? Well, it's because each one of them had their own combat zone. Each one of them had their own generals with their own aspirations and ambitions, and this creates a lot of rivalry. It really wasn't this united organization like the Grand Armée, where it was solely under Napoleon. It was really just a collection of units, each one with their own rivalries against the other. And so Napoleon forms the Grand Armée to partially crack down on some of those petty rivalries. And then also to further crack down on those petty rivalries and to try to make this a very effective unit. He's also going to promote, once he forms the Grand Armée, what's called Esprit de Corps, or the spirit of the body. Now, for the battlefield effectiveness of any unit, you need to have high morale within that unit. This could be either achieved through discipline or it could be achieved through some sort of, you could say, awards or mementos or honors that were given to the various units within the Grand Armée to demonstrate that Napoleon was actually recognizing their merits out on the battlefield. And so there are several ways that he's going to look to promote esprit de corps within the Grand Armée. Now, one of the key ways that he will, and I'm going to fast forward to this picture here, is he's going to issue out to every single regiment on their standards. He would allow them to cover mementos of their victory. Now, this particular standard that we see here, it comes from the French army much later on during the Second Empire under Louis Napoleon. But anyways, it would have looked very similar to this. You would have taken the standard. If and you'll see this in various other armies, they would apply particular honors like we see here. Perhaps they would put the name of a battle or a campaign that they had been involved in, that where they were victorious in, on there as well. And this would really serve as pride for that regiment. And the colors within the battle, whenever they're fighting, whether it's at Austerlitz, whether it's at Waterloo, or the various other battles, it would be a very valuable possession for the unit. And to lose one standard in battle, say to allow it to fall and eventually get into the hands of the enemy, whether it be the British, the Prussians, or whoever the French are fighting at that moment in time, would mean a loss of unit pride. It was a great stain, a great kind of mark against that particular unit. And so you would see that whenever the colored standard carrying this into battle, whenever they would fall, men would dive out of their way to try to get the standards and make sure that they continue to push the unit forward, that they would not fall into enemy hands, and so forth. Alongside these standards that he would issue out that would serve as unit prides for the various regiments in the Grande Armee, he's also going to hand out legions of honors to the units. And you'll see that during this period, I forget the exact figure, but he would hand out tens of thousands of these to various units. And you would see that there would be a number of episodes of courageous acts. And even I think Napoleon goes at one point himself that soldiers were just going out of their way to display really this high amount of merit on the battlefield to try to achieve this honor. And all this was to promote, once again, esprit de corps, to promote a high amount of morale within his army. And then through that, they could eventually go on and be very successful in future battles and so on and so forth. But anyways, as we've talked about the Grande Armée and the Spirit de Corps and kind of the crushing of petty rivalries, let's dive a little bit deeper into the average soldier and what they would have looked like within this army. Now, as I mentioned before, through the lever in masse policy, most of those who are going to be conscripted into the Grande Armée are going to fall between the ages of 20 to 25 years of age. Now, I forget the exact year, but it'll be later on in the Napoleonic Wars. It may be after 1812. I'm blanking on the year specifically, but you will start to see that conscription would begin to include individuals ages 18 to 25. So it will be eventually lax a little bit later on. But for the most part, you'll see that they're going to be between the ages of 20 to 25. This is not to say that you'll see somebody who will be 30 years old or somebody who will be younger. That does happen, and you do see it in the army. But for the most part, they'll be between that age group. As far as their what the average soldier would have looked like, obviously each individual has their own unique look, but the average soldier would have been roughly about 5'5", 5'6" tall, weighing perhaps somewhere in the neighborhood of 120 to maybe or maybe 130, 135 pounds. So as we can see, especially when we compare it today, the average soldier fighting in Napoleon's armies far smaller than people that we see today. And this actually brings up an interesting point because Napoleon, I'm sure at some point, you probably have heard, is relatively short, but he was 5'6", and as I've just described, I mean, that's pretty average for an individual of his time. I mean, really, to see somebody who is 6 feet tall, I mean, that's something that you see uh, pretty baseline here today in our own society. But I mean, to see somebody who is over 6 feet tall, I mean, one that comes to mind, George Washington, he was 6'2". I mean, that's an anomaly. But anyways, you see that they're much shorter than they are today. They weigh quite a bit less than what we'd see today as well. But anyways, moving on from that, the average soldier also they wouldn't have been highly literate. Most privates within the Grande Armée are not going to be able to read or write. Only about 25% of them will be able to read or write. But as you go up through the ranks, if you go to sergeant, if you go to your lieutenants, if you go all the way up the list, you do see that the literacy rates drastically improve. And this is also characteristic of what you would see within other armies at the time as well. And I do want to point out what really is going to really, the classes that you're going to see or the groups that are going to be highly literate will be the officer corps because there will be a little bit of a literacy test, I guess you could say, and qualifications in order to gain many of those offices. And it's no surprise whenever we do see letters pop up from soldiers, whether it be the Grande Armee or from the Napoleonic armies, many of them are coming from that officer corps. So even though you do see a breakdown in achieving those offices based off of birth within the French army. This is not to say that you'll see see that even illiterate soldiers could make it to those higher offices. But anyways, kind of going back to the average soldier, what about what he would have worn? What would the average soldier's uniform would have looked like within the Napoleonic army? Now, that's going to vary from unit to unit. Now, generally speaking, it'll look something like this. Now, this is a depiction of a grenadier over on the left, as well as a line infantryman, and we do see that they have similar color schemes that are involved, especially with their overcoat, their pants, but you do see that there are differences, especially if you look at their oh, I'm blanking these are called. But anyways, looking towards their boots, you start to see that there are different colors. You see it within their hats as well. And so you do see subtle differences. Now it does vary regiment to regiment depending on what colors are going or what color schemes will be adopted. But generally speaking, you would see this dark blue overcoat, which would be made of a woolen cloth. And you may be wondering, why are they going to be wearing woolen cloth? Why are they not going to be wearing cotton at this point? Because, I mean, at this point, cotton textiles, I mean, that was a growing industry. The reason that we'll see armies during this period, and then also up to the American Civil War, largely really refer to woolen clothing, wool clothing, is going to be because of its durability. Especially as we'll see with the soldiers whenever they go out and say the campaign to Russia. I mean, they're going to be campaigning for long periods of time in a number of different conditions, and on top of that, they could be fighting in forests. They could be fighting in wilderness, and so you need something that's extremely durable that will be able to last through such conditions. However, even though it is durable, you will see towards the end of campaigns, many of these soldiers are going to be relatively raggedy. Also, what they would have included with them, we see they'll have knapsacks, they'll have their cartridge boxes, they'll have all sorts. They should also have a canteen, as well as any sidearm weapons, bayonets that they might also include on their person. Not to mention their own musket, especially for your average private. Now, looking at the gear that this particular infantryman is carrying, I mean, it varies from infantryman to infantryman, but usually you could see somebody having upwards of about 30 kilograms in weight on their back. This is extremely difficult to carry, and especially when we'll see with these armies, they're going to be marching dozens, if not upwards of 20 miles in a single day out on any given campaign, and that'll just add to the wariness of these soldiers as they go throughout these campaigns. Um, but anyway, speaking of them actually out on campaign and the amount of equipment that they'll have on their backs, let's talk about the physical endurance that they're going to have to endure. Now, there's a famous quote by Napoleon when he's referring to his tactics. He says, "Speed, speed, speed." And one of the famed tactics that Napoleon uses is really these kind of lightning strikes. He wants to use his troops almost as foot cavalry. He wants to strike hard and strike fast. And with this is going to require his hundreds of thousands of troops to march upwards of 20, 25 miles, even 30 miles a day. I think there was in one period, I'll have to do the translation over from kilometers, but from what I was reading, there's one unit that had marched in 2 days over 100 kilometers. I mean, this takes a massive amount of physical endurance and strength. And as we've already pointed out, I mean, they have upwards of 40 pounds or more on their back and weight on top of their own body weight. So this does take a great amount of physical endurance and strength. And this will take a toll on them. Obviously, physically, when they go into bivouac, when they go into camp, they're going to be completely and utterly exhausted. But also on their actual uniforms, it would take a toll. especially in regards to their shoes. And shoes, these are something that are so important to the average soldier, not just during this period, but also up to our own present day. And it's often something that we see kind of looked over on by many individuals whenever they think about these conflicts and what these soldiers would have gone through. Now, this image that you see up here on the board, this is a drawing depicting the regulation shoe of the Napoleonic soldiers that were fighting in this conflict. It came in three sizes. It came in a small, a medium, and a large. And it was really supposed to be kind of a, I don't want to say a size fits all, but for those groups, a size fits all. And with that said, I mean, these shoes, they were mass produced and they're not going to be relatively durable. As I mentioned before, you're seeing these soldiers are marching 20 miles a day. And in long campaigns, they would march upwards of 200 miles during the course of a month or whatever the case is. And you could imagine their shoes, I mean, they're going to be completely worn down by this. Many soldiers, and we'll see this characteristic of armies throughout this period, especially when we talk about the soldiers of the U.S. Civil War. I mean, their shoes are just simply just going to fall off, and they're going to be marching barefoot through grueling conditions, whether it's say in the icy cold temperatures of Russia during the Russian invasion or in the buildup to the Battle of Waterloo. I mean, these soldiers are going to undergo these hardships of things that we don't think about ourselves, especially since we don't have to walk that far on our own daily uh, ventures. But anyways, nonetheless, that kind of demonstrates to us also on the soldiers' experience the importance of shoes. Whenever we do see battles take place, what would be a prized item for any victorious army is going to be the shoes of dead soldiers. And so you will see armies as they go out and loot the dead at night, or I shouldn't say just at night, but also whenever the battle is over and you have a victorious army, they'll loot for things like weapons, they'll loot for things like ammo, but most notably it'll be that of shoes because they're just so important to the soldiers' comfort out and fighting in one of these armies. Now, there is one other item I do want to kind of come back to this image that I'm looking at my notes that I didn't address a second ago. I do want to go back to the color schemes of the uniforms, and I know it may sound a little bit bizarre of why they might be using if you look at the British Army, a bright red color. If you look at obviously the French Army here, a dark blue color. Why are they using these colors that don't conceal them, like camouflage or at least some sort of basic khaki? Well, I want to point out that during this period, the uniforms, not only of the Grande Armee, but of armies in general, they're not meant for concealment. Really, what we see with battles that take place, concealment isn't a major issue quite yet. And I'll talk more about the tactics behind everything here in a moment. But, anyways, I just wanted to address that issue before we get into the tactics itself. So, now let's turn to the tactics of the Napoleonic Wars. How are these soldiers going to fight? Now, what you're going to see while reading John Keegan's The Face of Battle, as you read through the Battle of Waterloo, while it may come from the British perspective, it does give us a glimpse into what these soldiers would have experienced, especially in regards to the battlefield experience. Now, in regards to armies and how they're fighting at this moment in time, the simplest way that I could put it is that they're marching in these long, straight lines, almost as if they're marching on parade. Now, the weapons, I want to talk about them really quickly. They're really going to dictate why we see armies fighting in this fashion during this period, as well as in previous conflicts building up to this period. Now, by the time we get to the 1800s, we see that all armies, European, American, as well as virtually most forces and nations across the world, have begun to, in some fashion, adopt the rifled musket. This fires a slow-moving projectile, a musket ball. I don't know the various speeds that it fires at, but it's a very slow-moving projectile that they would fire that was relatively inaccurate. And we see this with the Brown Bess British musket that you see here. But anyways, this weapon is really going to demonstrate what the experience is going to be like for these soldiers. Now, in regards to this weapon, as I mentioned a moment ago, it is relatively inaccurate. And it's largely because of the fact that we'll see in many cases the musket balls that will be rammed down these barrels aren't going to be the exact caliber of these barrels. And why does that matter? Well, it's because if it's slightly smaller, what's going to end up happening is whenever that trigger is pulled, it's going to rattle down the barrel. When it shoots out the end of the barrel, it could shoot up, it could shoot down, it could shoot straight, it could shoot in a whole number of directions. And so it makes it very inaccurate. Now, what also makes it inaccurate, and this is something when I talk about with my History 1301 classes when I go through the US Civil War, is you'll see most muskets during this period used by both armies are not going to have rifling. Now, rifling, I do want to point out, has been invented by this point, and you do see things like the Kentucky rifle. If you look at the American frontier, it does have rifling, but for the most part, you'll see most European armies have not used it as standard issued yet. Same thing with this Brown Bess British musket. They'd be smooth bores. And so what this means is that the projectile doesn't have anything to grip on to spin. And think about it like this. If you know nothing about guns, think about throwing a football. When you throw a spiraled football, it's far more accurate than if you allowed that football to tumble over itself. Well, without that rifling, you can't create that spiraling effect, and so it's not very accurate. And so the question is, if these rifles aren't very accurate, how can you maximize their firepower? And that's where you'll start to see that both armies, and once again, this happens long before the Napoleonic Wars, to maximize their volume of fire, they march out in these long lines. They get anywhere between say 50 to 100 yards apart from the other army who's also marching shoulder to shoulder in long lines. And then they would level their rifles all at once. They would fire what's called a volley, which is just everybody pulling the trigger all at once. And the hope was that if you had, say, 10,000, or I shouldn't say 10,000, let's say you had 1,000 muskets pointed in the same direction, you're bound to hit something if all of those fire all at once. Now, they will adopt more elaborate tactics than that, but these volleys are going to be characteristic of armies, even up to the American Civil War, and we'll see in some ways they're going to be used even in conflicts after that. But anyways, this weapon that dictates those tactics. But you start to see by this period, armies begin to maximize how they fight with these tactics, which will make the battlefields, just simply put it, far more bloody. Now, I do want to point out what is unique about the musket by this point. Increasingly, it's making warfare impersonal. What do I mean by that? You're starting to see that it's fought from a distance. If we go back to the medieval period, when we talked about the code of chivalry, when we talked about knights fighting out on the battlefield, that was in hand-to-hand combat. It was very personal. You witness your victim. You actually dealt the killing blow. However, increasingly, and we'll see this more so as we get to the Civil War, and especially by the time we get to World War One, the distance between an individual and the individual that they kill was beginning to increase. So oftentimes, if you pulled this trigger, especially if the smoke that they would create, you probably aren't going to see the person that you ever shot and killed. You probably won't even know that you killed anyone during the course of one of these conflicts. And so increasingly becomes impersonal and fought from a distance. Now, with these weapons, what I also want to point out is it's going to greatly impact the soldier's experience in another fashion. And this is something that was pointed out in the Face of Battle within the Waterloo chapter. Is what we start to see with these weapons is they're not black or they're not smokeless. They're black powder rifles. What happens is when you pull the trigger, this flint over here is going to strike here, cause its own explosion here, and then you'll see when the bullet comes out the other end, you'll see that there would be a large cloud of smoke. Now, this is where I want to go back to this image here, because it does greatly represent kind of what the battlefield will look like for the average soldier. When you see thousands of these rifles begin to go off, I mean, the smoke would have just been unbearable. I mean, it would have created this dense fog that you couldn't see through, and it further adds to why warfare was becoming increasingly impersonal by this point. Furthermore, I mean, when you talk about, say, the Battle of Waterloo, which lasted virtually all day, I mean, imagine if you're one single soldier. I mean, I'm going to use a number from the U.S. Civil War just because that's my area of expertise. But that was also a black powder war, and you would see soldiers would be firing upwards of 40 rounds of in any individual battle. That's how much that they would carry in their cartridge boxes. And this is not to mention all the ammo that would be brought up to them, or if they picked it off the deck said, or if it was brought up to them from the rear and so forth. But let's say if they were firing, one soldier were firing 40 rounds in one of these battles. Then you got to think at the Battle of Waterloo, you have 200 some odd thousand soldiers that are also doing similar things. So that's a lot of smoke and gunpowder that's being discharged. Furthermore, you got to think about the cannon, which require far more gunpowder to send their projectiles downrange. And so, what battlefields would have looked like during this period, they would have been completely covered in smoke. And your average soldier, they're really not going to be able to see much outside of their immediate vicinity. And that's why, whenever you do read through primary documents, especially after the period, it's difficult to kind of unpack, whether or not these soldiers are talking about their actual experience or about events that they have read about after the conflict. But for most soldiers, whenever they would look at their immediate vicinity, they would only see the enemy charging them, they countercharge, and so forth. And that will slightly change as we'll get to future conflicts, but it's going to make the fog of war, is what it's called, extremely distinct and unique within these battlefields. But anyways, I think that's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover in regards to the Grand Armée. Unfortunately, I know there's actually on YouTube where I'm posting some of these videos. I know that there is somehow a big following that has developed over my recent lectures that I've been releasing with this course. Unfortunately, I'm not going to be talking about organization or really the overall. What happens in various battles and campaigns and so forth. I wanted to focus more on just the soldiers' experience within the Grand Armée. So please look it up, research it if you're interested in that. But anyways, I'm going to go ahead and end this lecture on this note. Before I go ahead and end it, just like always, if you do have any questions, always feel free to reach out to me. But also make sure that you're reviewing all lectures from this week. Make sure you're reviewing all materials and that you're getting all some assignments turned in on time. But anyways, that's all I got for y'all. Everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see everybody in the next video.